Welcome, everyone. I'm so excited about today's episode. I have a lovely Julia Malott, and I hope I got that right, with
You
a lot
did.
of thoughts. I love your tag as well, and I'm super excited to have an opportunity to talk to you because, like I said just earlier, and even when we first connected, is I don't know a lot about this subject, but wow, do people have opinions? And I'm not one to jump into something without having a little bit of knowledge first or firsthand personal experience. And I thought, who else better than to talk to than Julia herself, who you've really put yourself out there, and I certainly appreciate it. So I'd like to hear your story, and maybe if it could just start with who you are. I didn't want to name or label you in any way. That was incorrect. So I'm going to let you take it from here.
Yeah, absolutely. How far back do you want me to go? Do you want me to talk about my whole transition story? Do you want me to talk about really the last few years and how I became more of a public voice on it? Or do we want to do both?
No, definitely both. So a little bit about as much as I know is you're in Ontario. So just
okay.
a
Well,
bit
that's
of background
true.
as well.
Absolutely. So yes, I live in Ontario in Canada. I'm in Toronto, and I've been in this area my whole life. I grew up in a small farming town about 2 hours from Toronto. No diversity, the same 30 kids were the kids I went to school with, kind of all the way from kindergarten up until grade 8 when I went to a slightly bigger high school, but still quite small. And I also had a very strong religious upbringing. So my family has attended evangelical churches pretty much my whole life. I think we started in the United Church, and then by the time I was 5, we moved to an evangelical one. And along with that, I have always held gender dysphoria. And I like to qualify that when I say always, because I know that when you're really young, like you don't know what that is. And so I don't want to lie or make it sound like I somehow knew that when I was young, but everyone knew my life wasn't working. I saw 4 different counselors before I was in grade 6 because Jason didn't have any friends. I was Jason, by the way, at that point, and Jason didn't have any friends, and Jason didn't get along with the boys. And I had these severe anxiety issues where I would like put my hands on my face and I wouldn't even pull them away because I was just so anxious and miserable. And it all started when school started. My mom would say I was the happiest kid, when I was 3 and 4 and friendly and outgoing, and then school happened and I just closed right up. And I over time, I started to understand in myself what was going on in terms of understanding that I didn't feel like the boys. I didn't understand how to get along with the boys. And there was this expectation that I should be playing the sports, that I should be in those social circles. And the counselors I had were not particularly helpful because this was the 90s. And so I think now people would have very quickly zeroed in on there might be a gender thing or a sexuality thing or something going on. But at that point in time, nobody was thinking about that, at least not the counselors I had. And they were all religious counselors as well. So that might have also been part of it. But when I was in grade 7, that was kind of the moment for me that it really started to reach a point that I was getting a verbal awareness of how I was feeling. So I had this friend, and I was talking with him on the playground once in grade 7. And I remember making this comment saying something like, but everyone just thinks the grass is greener on the other side, right? Like all boys kind of wish they were girls sometimes, and all girls kind of wish they were boys. And he just kind of looked at me. He's like, "No, I don't think so. I don't think most people feel that way." And I was like, "Yeah, me neither." And then I went home that night. And I was like, "Okay, like that was kind of the clicking moment of maybe I'm feeling something different. Maybe this isn't how everybody just feels." And this was early 2000s. So there was nothing in our education system about it. There was nothing online about it really from a kind of professional, institutional sense, but there were these blogs that these various people would put on about being transgender. And it was usually called transsexual back then, but it was the same topic. So I started to come across these blogs. And when I was reading them, I thought, like, this echoes my feelings exactly. And it was a very different era than today, of course. At this point in time, there's no legalization. There's extreme marginalization of anybody who's transgender. So these are not people who are doing it for an identity purpose or an attention purpose. These are people who are desperate, who have kind of landed on this because nothing else was working. And so as I read their stories and hear what they said, I thought, wow, this really does reflect how I've always felt. And so that gave me some positioning. I thought, wow, I understand what I'm feeling. I know what's going on. And I have no idea what to do with it because I'm in this deeply religious household. And this was right around the time that gay marriage, of course, was a hot issue in Canada. And it was a hot issue in my church. And so we have these speakers coming in talking to us about how bad this is, that, Canada might create an environment where people are legally allowed to be gay and how sinful and horrible that is. And as this kid who's just moving into adolescence, I was thinking, wow, like if being gay is so bad and so sinful and so disgusting, then I don't even know what I am, but I'm several steps further than that. No one's even talking about that. And I assume people didn't even know about it because I had never heard the word transgender. It wasn't mentioned anywhere. I only found it online. So my way of coping with this was to internalize it all. And I internalized it and I didn't talk about it. And I held a lot of shame around kind of I'd say my identity, but saying my identity is maybe a false way to put it because I hadn't adopted that identity. I was Jason, I was a boy, but around how I felt about gender, around my discomfort. And I really shared it with almost nobody for the next 20 years. I told my girlfriend when I was 18, and I eventually married her. So 4 years later at 22, we got married. And you're smiling
So
there,
she
but
knew.
What was that?
She knew.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She knew, but we both didn't know what to do with it. She went to my church too, and I told her about it. And I'm like, but I'm not going to transition and stuff. I guess I should back up too. So a few years earlier, I was a very rational kid. So I remember thinking, like, if I want to pass and be able to go through this world and have nobody know, I needed to transition at, 14 at the latest. So at like 12, 13 years old, I'm thinking I could do this, but I'd have to run away from home and I'd have to pay for all these things. So I had the spreadsheet going of all the costs, and I was like, oh, like toilet paper, these things, they add up really fast. And how am I going to do this? And it's funny looking back because I didn't even contemplate telling my parents. In my head, it was like, well, I can't do that. So the only option here is I run away and I do it, or I don't transition.
Yeah.
And the pragmatic side of me was like, well, I guess I don't transition. This isn't a path I can take. So I didn't. And then I dove really deep into my faith kind of as a compensatory measure and moved to the point of suppression. So I tell my girlfriend at 18, we don't do anything about it. We just kind of suppress it. Over the next maybe 10 years, I told maybe 2 or 3 people. I told a psychologist once that when I was in university in the counseling department, and I told a friend, I think when I was 23, 24, but really I didn't talk about it, but it was very much present in my life and everything. And I was miserable, as I guess the simplest way to put it. I was a bad husband. I was a bad friend, and I was miserable because I had chosen not to pursue what I knew was going to relieve what I was feeling. That went on until I was 28. And at 28, everything kind of crashed. My marriage crashed, which was very much my doing. My social circles crashed, and I hit this point where I realized that I was going to kill myself where I was going to transition. So I didn't end up in the hospital at the suicide ward, which was fantastic. Not at the time, but it was fantastic looking back, because that was the moment that I started to get psychiatric help and really look at this and talk about this and think about this. And that ultimately led me down the path of transition that I find myself on today. And I did it almost begrudgingly. In a way, it was kind of, well, nothing else is working, so I might as well try this. And if it works, then great. And if not, I can kill myself later. As I said, very rational, in a certain way. But what I didn't realize at the time, and I was able to kind of grasp later on, was that I had 2 things going on. I had this gender dysphoria that I had and still have. I also had this shame bubble that I'd created because I was suppressing it, because I wasn't sharing it, because I was hiding it, and because I was inauthentic with everybody in my life. Mm-hmm. My parents, my siblings, and all of my friends. And the process of transitioning broke down both of those. Sure, it alleviated the dysphoria, but it also dealt with my shame, because all of a sudden, as a non-passing trans person, you present yourself to the world in a way that everybody knows something very personal about me the moment I walk into a room. And that can be a curse, but it can also be a blessing, because I can't hide from it. It kind of forced me into a place of having to be authentic, which, seeing the power in that authenticity now, like, I would never go back, because that's enabled me to have these much more authentic relationships and be much more authentic about myself. And and it's funny because in this transgender domain, people so often use the word authentic to be equated with true self, like you are the gender you feel. I don't mean it like that. I just mean authentic as in, I have this deeply uncomfortable relationship with gender, and everybody knows it. Everybody in my life knows it. And that's empowering to me, that I can't hide behind it. I can't put on a presentation of being all put together. Everybody knows that. And I leaned into it over time. So that was my transition. Any comments you want to make before I go into the next phase?
So many, and so many things. I was taking notes because there's a lot, like I said, I really don't know a lot about this subject at all. And so there's a lot of terms you used, and I, not just the terms, but I want to get a better understanding. So you started with, I think you said like you've had gender dysphoria all your life, basically.
Yes.
I think and so what is gender dysphoria?
Yeah, so gender dysphoria is how we used to bracket transgender matters. And I'm sure later in the conversation, we'll talk to why I say used to rather than continue to. But it is this deep psychological distress with your birth sex. So I'm biologically male. I know that. We all know that. And that really did not work for me. And there's a lot of research and a lot of opinions on why that is and what that means, the extent to which that's biologically rooted, the extent to which it's psychosocial. But what it means at its core is that I have a strong conviction that that doesn't work. I don't know how to go through the world like that with the expectations and the sociological norms that are placed upon maleness.
And that I'd like to get into that a little bit more, because you said that that's something you struggled with, like trying to fit into the male mold, I guess. So what were some of the things that were like, you mentioned the one thing when you verbalized it, but what were other thoughts and feelings and concerns that you had that you're like, this doesn't really sit with me in the male gender?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question. And it's funny. I find myself in this conversation a lot right now with where our politics sit, because I think a lot of people believe that we're at this place where we are empowered to do whatever we want, right? We've broken down these stereotypes and girls can do anything and boys can do anything. And I don't believe that's true. I don't know how you feel, but I certainly feel like there are still, there's still plenty of expectations there. And there was an amazing book by Richard Reeves that came out last year. It's called Of Boys and Men. And he talks about a lot of the reasons why men are struggling in society right now, the conversation that isn't happening, especially on the progressive side, because they're the oppressor. So we're not supposed to credit them for anything they could be struggling with. But he talks about how the last 80 years have brought about an era where we have broken down some of the stereotypes and some of the bracketing of what women can do in society. I say some because certainly there's still lots that exist, but we've enabled, career expansion. We've enabled participation in lots of domains that didn't exist before, but we haven't actually done the same thing on the male side. The example that I like to use kind of very clearly is clothing. It's a very tangible one we can all see of. There's pretty much no clothing that a woman cannot wear, right? If you like baggy tomboy clothing, if you like jeans and a sweater, you can wear that. And that's fine. That's not just it's not just that you're allowed to, it's acceptable. There is stuff that's shaped to the women body that works. No one judges you for that. When you're a man, you have very strict, you wear pants, you wear shorts, but not to work. You wear t-shirts, you wear, polo shirts, you wear button-up shirts, and that's it. Like when I transitioned, just learning like what the difference was between a cardigan and a blouse and all these different categories, because there's so many. And it's like, and then people will say, well, men can wear those things. And it's like, yes, you're right. Legally speaking, a man can wear a dress. And we all know how that gets received. And when Harry Styles pulls it off, it's accepted because he's Harry Styles. He's a celebrity and he can make a statement. But when an average man walks down the street, we know the things people say. We know the way people react to that. And those are the kind of sociological limitations that I experienced as a kid. Not that I was obsessed with dresses, let's say, but the boys play like this. The boys do these things. The boys like the superheroes. The boys like the foot hockey. That was a big thing in my school.
Clicked. And it didn't click with you ever.
Exactly. It never clicked. Because what did I want to do? I wanted to sit in the circle over there and play the hand games, and just talk. Like, what do I do with my friends now? We get together and we talk for hours and hours and hours. And that's how I know how to socialize. And the environment I grew up in, which was a small conservative farming town, so that might have played into part of it, but the environment I grew up in was very much, there wasn't a place for that. That boys are supposed to do these things, and that was the approach that was taken with me too. And I wasn't finding those social connections. What did the counselor say? Well, buy Jason a basketball net. If Jason can get better at basketball, then maybe he'll get along with the boys. So when I was struggling, well, go and practice basketball. And I hated basketball. I wanted to play with my sister's Polly Pockets, but I'd be sent outside to play basketball and shoot hoops, which I still can't do, even though I had a basketball net my entire childhood.
Yeah. It's so interesting you're saying that, because like to suggest that females and males could be the same is it's just so wrong, because we know psychologically we're so different. And it's interesting your experience, because I actually read one account of a female transitioning in to a male, and she said that I think it was in What is the Woman, but more information about people on that, something else I saw. But she had never experienced so much isolation as a man. She said that she would have in the bathroom, and as girls, we all know you'll go to the bathroom in a group, and we're often made fun of. And what happens? We end up chatting and talking about it. And she said she had more like intimate conversations with strangers in the bathroom as a woman than males. When she transitioned, she just became so isolated. And going back like history, is what was women's job when it was like hunter gathering? We were social and picking berries with the babies. So we were talking loud so that the bears wouldn't come. Whereas the males were opposite. They were quiet. They were individual because they were hunting the bears. So they were trying not to get it. So like, this stuff is innate in us. And to suggest that all of that is gone completely is just not reality, really. And I'm like you, I'm so practical. So like, it's hard for me not to like think through all of the scenarios. And it's funny you mentioned the clothes, because that's something we commented on. I had just seen your post about drag shows and drag queens, and like, I'm all for it. I've been to them. They're fun. But number one, you're supposed to be 18. Everyone I've been to, they've been at the bar. And then the second thing is, I never really thought about it because you mentioned it, and I'd like to talk about it since we were talking about clothes, but like the way the clothing is, and here I've put on like extra makeup on purpose too, because it's so exaggerated too. And that's not even, I feel a little bit clownish today, honestly, because I don't put this much on. But like when a man is dressing up as a woman in the drag shows, it's big. It's just, it's not even female. It's not reality again, which is what they're trying to do. So I don't know if you had some other thoughts about it, because we kind of exchanged comments online.
Yeah, no, I think you've nailed it. And something that someone said to me once that I thought was really poignant on this was, what would happen if a woman did that, right? Like
Yes.
if a woman were to dress like that and go to the school and read the book, would we still celebrate it? If that was how my classroom teacher dressed every day for her kids, would I celebrate that? Or would I be like, I don't know how I feel about that? And quite honestly, I know the answer, because Halton District School Board is not far from me. And they had that issue with that transgender teacher in 2022, and I was a voice who was participating in the delegations with the parent group there, and we saw how people respond to that dress. And if it was somebody who was biologically female doing that, we'd respond that way as well. And yet the moment we call it drag, we treat it differently in a way that I don't think it's helpful, and I don't understand why.
Yeah, neither. And so I'm glad we're having this conversation, because I think as practical people, we have to just at least talk about it and comment about it. And if there is a reason why, sure, let's talk about it. But if there isn't, and we're just assuming things, this is going to help someone, when it, in fact, hearing your story, it seems like it harms people more, or at least doesn't benefit the conversation. So there's a couple of things you mentioned too, like you said extreme marginalization, and I just wrote those words down, but I didn't even get the context about it. So maybe if you could tell me, I think you were talking about how transgenderism is now, or how people feel, and you use the words extreme marginalization. So tell me more about that. Or what does that
was that
mean?
on that same post you thinking of?
No, just earlier in our conversation.
Oh, okay. Yeah, well,
Yeah, I think you were saying it like as things have changed, because before it was like a conversation about gender dysphoria, and then it's become extremely marginalized,
yeah.
I think.
Well,
And so I just would like to understand that a bit better.
I think that's a great segue into kind of the second piece of my story.
Okay.
So I ended up transitioning. I've had a social, a hormonal, and a surgical transition. So I've done the full gamut. I am remarried. I have an adopted daughter now. And my adopted daughter is actually my partner's little sister. There was some physical and emotional abuse in the family and in the household, and that ultimately led to me taking her on during the beginning of COVID. So about 3 years ago, my partner's chronically ill. So she was unable to be the primary caregiver, and I was at a point in my life that I was ready to have somebody to care for. So I took her on, and she came and lived with me, which meant that she was moving from a much smaller rural high school to go to a big city high school. And so she started there for her grade 10 year. And I was really scared because I was thinking of how things were when I was in school 20 years ago. And I wouldn't have been comfortable with someone who had a transgender parent. I probably would have judged them. And I thought, is this going to be a barrier for my daughter to be able to fit in and have connections that I'm transgender? And is it going to become a rift in our relationship? Will she resent me? And as it turned out, I couldn't have been further from the truth because things have changed a lot in the last 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
And at first it felt awesome because I was cool. The kids were like, that's awesome. Like your parents transgender and stuff. And I thought, wow, like this is so great. And I think that lasted for about 3 weeks until I realized like, no, actually, this is not great because I don't need to be celebrated. It's great that I'm not, as you said, marginalized. I'm not pushed to the edge of society as though I don't matter and I should be ignored because we don't know what to do with Julia. But I also don't need to be celebrated because I'm just a normal person trying to live a normal life, right? I'm not special in that sense. I just happen to be transgender. And I realized very quickly how fixated we are in the school system right now on these transgender matters, how cool it is in a certain sense, because it has become a form of identity. For me, it has never been a form of identity. It's just a reality. And I think that's a very healthy way to interact with this. There's a politician, a Canadian politician who I know who is gay. And when I was talking to her once, she described the same thing. She described herself as heteronormative, even though she is a lesbian. But she's like, I'm not, it's a fact about me and people know it, but it's not something I talk about much. It's not something that's particularly important. And she's like, and I feel very disconnected from the LGBT world and all of that because it's not my life. And what I observed watching my daughter's school was that there's a huge wave of children and young adults who have made transgender matters an identity, in the sense that they're focused on it, their social circle revolves around it, everything is fixated on being part of this group. And I don't think that's a good thing. And that kind of comes down to the shift in our narrative of how we are viewing these matters. Classically speaking, we would view transgender matters through that lens of gender dysphoria. It's described in a great book by an individual named Mark Yarhouse as the disability framework, where there's something wrong with me. I am biologically male, and that didn't work. And since we live in a prosperous and caring society, we can allow me to thrive. There's things we can do to support me so that I can have a good life and I can contribute to our society. And I think that's great. It's not any different than someone who's in a wheelchair. And we can build elevators, we can build ramps. So we should, and we do. And that allows them to thrive. But we don't say that there's nothing wrong with their legs. We don't change the narrative to say some people have legs and some people have non-working legs, and that's all, phenotypically normal. We say, no, like their legs are not working, and we can accommodate that. I view myself in that lens, and that's how we used to view transgender matters. In the last 10 to 15 years, the deconstructive approach to gender has come in and kind of reframed that conversation to be focused on diversity, on finding your true self, your individuality, your creativity in it. I don't think it's a mistake that it's come along in the same era where the names that we give our children has exploded. I've always been obsessed with baby names. I love to go to the US Social Security's database because they give it all to you, and you can just plug the data and see how names have changed over time. And we've all seen that trend that the classic names have gone away. And it seems like so many people want to pick new, creative, different names. So they take a name and they find a new, creative, different way to spell it. And that's not helpful. Names are spelt so that we can communicate. And when you take Catherine and you decide to add a silent GHT in the middle, you haven't done your child a service. And yet every year there's more people who are doing that because we seem to have this obsession with finding a way to be different and to express yourself and all of these trends in our society. And LGBT matters and transgender matters, and gender itself has very much become part of this mix. And that's not a bad thing in and of itself. I'm friends with an author named Lisa Sullen Davis, and she wrote a book called Tomboy about 5 years ago, where she kind of looks at tomboys from the very beginning of, I say time, like 100 years ago up till today, and kind of the trends we've gone through. And that's a form of gender nonconformity, right? Those are girls who pushed back in the 70s against the stereotypical femininity and said, no, I can be like this. And that's great, and that's healthy. And I think that is wonderful. However, that gender nonconformity now has been blended and morphed into a world of social and medical transition, which is very different. In other words, if you are looking for identity as a 15-year-old and you want to call yourself demisexual, or you want to wear this, and do it, experiment, that's fine. That's not damaging. But when we move into gender, when we move into the way those conversations are being had, that can and that does lead to social, medical, and hormonal transitions, which for those gender dysphoric people like myself, that has always been a powerful tool. I'm an advocate, and I think it's important we protect it. But that's not very many kids. When I was a kid, they estimated that to be 1 in 5,000. And that was probably an underestimate because it wasn't talked about very much. But my school board last year said 39% of their kids identify as LGBT. And
What?
because they're all bi, because they're this, because it's cool, right? Because I know they're kids. And when it's at 39%, I'm like, okay, I also don't think that is helpful. And
it's not even, it can't even be real. It can't, because, and this is what I was just chatting about a little bit earlier, is how much we have changed. Like, any adult knows that when you're at 15 or 7 or 21 or 25 or 30, you have a very different view of the world and of your identity. And I said this earlier, is I don't like any labels, honestly. Like, I don't at all even enjoy people saying you're a lawyer, because that's already a label on me. And it's like, it's an identity to some people. So they identify me as a lawyer, but I'm not. I'm Eva. And I've always been that way. And so that's why this conversation and this identity thing is just so strange to me. And to suggest that 39 people are this way, like, I'm Eva, just Eva, please, Eva. And it's funny, you just with the names, I want to add this one part, is that I very much agree with you about how much names affect. And when you're a child in school, my name was spelled EWA when I was going through school, and that's the Polish way. There is no V in the Polish language, so the W is like a V. And I was very shy. My parents were a bit older, and I'm very disciplined, very nice young girl. And they would always say, Iwa, something. And I'd be like, that's me. I would never correct them.
Oh.
And I think that affected me. That affects you as you're growing up, when you're just trying to discover who you are, because, like you've been saying, identity is just so important. Something like a name. Kids are already struggling with that. And then to add this incredibly complicated thing, like sex and gender, is just mind-boggling to me. So sorry to take it away from you for a second.
No, I think that's completely on point. And I understand why they did it, because they look at the era that I grew up in and they're like, wow, we really didn't serve a lot of gender dysphoric kids like Jason well. We should fix that. But their approach to doing so has been to, overcompensate, to now talk about it all the time with all the kids all over the place. And it would make me laugh if it wasn't so sad, because we don't need to do that. Like, I was severely gender dysphoric, 4 counselors before the age of grade 6. Like, if any counselors were trained in this back then, they would have been like, I wonder. And if they'd ever asked me, do you wish you're a girl? I would have been like, yes, I do. Like, I knew it. I just wasn't saying it.
Changed, though? So how would have that changed for you, do you think, like, looking back, if you had that conversation, they had that conversation with you?
How would that have changed?
Yeah. Or would it not?
It's a tough question, because the culture was a very different place back then, right? We transition wasn't readily available, certainly wasn't funded. And it was marginalized, right? It was judged much more. It's still judged today, but it was judged much more harshly than it is now. Given that, with my religious roots as well, like, I don't think that would have been available to me, even if a counselor or someone had brought it up with my parents when I was 10 years old or 12 years old, or at any of those points. But today we could be having that world. Lots of people will ask me, what do I wish the schools were doing today?
Yes.
And my answer to that is, cut out most of what we're teaching about LGBT matters and keep the pieces that teach acceptance. I always use the analogy to religion. We have a school system that I believe is broadly successful when it comes to protecting religious diversity, but not advocating for it, right? We do not want an education system that teaches your kid that they should be Christian or they should be Muslim. But we do want an education system that protects Christian and Muslim kids from being marginalized or bullied or anything else for their religious upbringing and for their beliefs. We could do the same thing here. We can teach those young kids, yes, some people have two moms. We respect that. Okay, moving on, right? We don't have to celebrate it, but we can say, yeah, that's going to happen. Yeah, this kid here, is now Jennifer. Okay, moving on, right? We don't have to celebrate, but we can just be like, this is what's happening. They're kids. They don't care. They'll do what we say. But instead, what has happened is almost this obsession with wanting to find the kids like me really early. So you see these cases that come up in Ontario again and again where kindergarten or grade 1 or grade 2 students are being asked, like, what gender are you? Are you sure? Could you be this? And it's like, we don't need to ask them that. They will tell you if they're truly dysphoric. But that's that diversity piece. If we moved into this space where, since it's diversity for the sake of diversity, well, why not let them find their true selves? It's like what color you paint your picture in kindergarten. Well, use all the paints, make it whatever you want, Timmy. It'll be beautiful no matter what you do. And we're treating it the same way. And that's where I don't think we're doing our kids a service.
So clearly, I know you're an advocate in this area in some regard. Are people, school boards seeking you out, or elected officials, or are you going to them and are they receptive? Like, what's going on with that whole conversation and discussion?
Right. It is a very politically charged matter right now. So school boards, broadly speaking, are amongst our most progressive left organizations right now. That's a trend that, there's several reasons for it. One of them is just the union pressure that has played upon them for the last 50 years. But broadly speaking, the directors of education in most school boards tend to be very progressive left-leaning. And the unions have done a great job of getting trustees in place who tend to be very progressive left-leaning, usually more left than the local population overall. So the boards themselves don't tend to want someone like me to come and speak, because I'm not saying the right things. I'm not taking that postmodernistic deconstructive approach to saying it's all about diversity, find your true self, explore, that sort of attitude. I'm saying, no, men and women do exist, and we should let that happen. That's kind of my basic tenet of approaching this is, if there's a kid we could transition, or they could be happy not transitioned, we should take the second path. We should not transition that kid, right? It's something we do when they're desperate. Just like if there's a kid who could walk, or we could put them in a wheelchair, we're going to let them walk. And that isn't actually a popular opinion right now in the school sector. The sector is, no, let people explore, let people find it. So the boards don't tend to be a huge fan, but there are individual trustees who certainly rely upon me because they are concerned. They tend to come from the classical liberal perspective. They're very concerned with the way that they're seeing discourse being shut down, seeing that parents can't express concerns with books or concerns with any of these matters. And so I have school board connections across the country of trustees that I've helped to support. I have counselors in local government across the country who I've helped to support. And then at both the provincial and the federal level, the conservative side of our parties has tended to lean into me. And there's a number of politicians who I do work with and consult with to support them and to kind of, discuss some of these matters. But yeah, it's an interesting discussion we have right now with the division.
Well, and that's why I was so happy to talk to you, because who better to talk to than somebody that's lived the experience, rather than just somebody that's coming up with their own thoughts or their own perspective on it. So that's why I was wondering whether or how much consultation or how many people are reaching out to you to hear, because isn't that the whole point of diversity and inclusion? So I don't get those words when we're excluding people all the time.
I know. Diversity, equity, and inclusion. I laugh because it sounds great. It sounds like something we should all want. And I do want it. I want diversity, I want equity, and I want inclusion. I just don't want what that has come to mean in our modern discussion of it.
Yes.
Because it's meant shutting down anything that isn't a very specific perspective on diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yeah, I have so many questions I want to ask you, but I try to keep these kind of limited, because then people are like, 3 hours is too long. And you could always do it again, which I would love to. But I'd like to know a little bit more about practically how the transition was. And so there's 2 questions I still want to talk about. And the second one will come back. But, this is a very serious thing. And I think that's something that kind of gets glossed over. To change from a man to a woman or a woman to man, it's like, we could just make it happen because that's how everything is just so easy in our society these days. You don't have to hunt for food, it's there. And I
Yeah.
feel like that's part of what's happened with this. Oh, you want to be a man? Sure, no problem. We could get you that special order number 2. And I feel that that's a little bit because of our culture. So can you you did it at about 28, I think I got the time right?
Yeah,
Or
28 years old and started in, what was it, 2018?
so how was that? And then what I'd like to hear too is, does it make sense to you that at the age of 28 it made more sense? And I don't want to ask I don't want you to think back in time, but just for kids in the future, like maybe does it make sense? Let's try this at 14 and see where it goes, or does it make sense? Let's maybe wait until we're a bit more adult. So kind of your perspective on that, what your thoughts are.
It's something I'm working on a book on because
Okay.
it's such a complex topic of
Yeah.
the childhood social transition. And I see very few people who really want to have an authentic conversation. They have an agenda. They're either there to protect it or they're there to fight against it. And so they're not really willing to look at both sides. They're just arguing it from one or the other. The thing that I think we have to keep in mind is, why would a kid want to transition? And what I mean by that is, kids want lots of things. My daughter's been talking about wanting a tattoo for a few years, and she doesn't have one yet. And she's 17. She might get one this year. I'm coming around to the idea of a small one, maybe in certain places, but I've always said, you might regret this. What if you get the lyrics to that song all over your arm, and then you realize that you don't love that musician when you're 24, and now you're stuck with
Yeah.
it? And so I'm protecting her from that in a sense, but I believe that's a good thing, because there's no real loss to waiting. The only loss is she didn't get to be the cool kid with the lyrics to her favorite song in her arm when she was 12. And that's it, right? And I think a lot of people kind of compare that to these gender transitions and say, just wait. Just wait till you're 18 or you're 20 or you're 22 or you're 25 or whatever age we believe is acceptable. And if you still feel this way at that point, then you can transition, and we'll support that. And I like the sound of it. And I wish we lived in a world where that was practical. But what gets missed is, you've gone through puberty. Yes, you missed out on your high school experience as the other, gender and those sorts of things, which is a loss. Like, I do feel that. But the much more important thing is, you won't pass. And by pass, what I mean is being able to disappear into society by convincingly appear as a member of the opposite sex. If you don't go through a puberty that's aligned with your biological sex, and whether that's because you're on blockers or whether that's because you start cross-sex hormones really young, then broadly speaking, phenotypically, you go into the sexual development of the other sex, right? So boys like myself, if I had started on estrogen when I was 10 or 12, or if I'd been on blockers and started when I was 14 or 15, you wouldn't know. You wouldn't be able to tell now, right? Because my voice wouldn't be lower, because my jawline wouldn't be so broad, because my eyes here, I have these deep brow lines. Those wouldn't have developed the way that they did if I had that. And kids know this, right? And so kids are thinking, I feel this pain and anxiety because I don't fit in society where I feel that I would like to be, where I belong, with what might make sense to me. And in order to get that, I need to do this now. That was what I felt at that age. I need to do this now, not at 25 I can do it, because you can do it, but it's a very different experience when you don't pass. And so where I think this conversation needs to go is recognizing that passability doesn't have to be everything, but we make it everything. We because we live in a very sexualized society, because if you look at the conversations we're having right now, there's a reason why they're mostly focused around transgender women. And that's because transgender women are the ones who tend not to pass. Physiologically speaking, the changes that testosterone brings about in your body, like a lower voice or like those, kind of angular, more masculine developments, those are not reversible. Versus when you look at someone who's biologically female, who goes on to testosterone later, they'll grow facial hair, their voice will lower. Most broadly speaking, they'll pass. They'll be shorter, typically. They might have wider hips. So there can be some signs, but for the most part, a 20 or 24-year-old female who decides they want to transition will be able to pass to the point that when their clothes are on, when we're not looking at genitals, when they're at the supermarket, when they want to go to the washroom, when they're wherever they need to be, no one's going to know. So even if people aren't okay with the idea of a biological female doing those male things, they're not going to know that they're doing it. But someone like myself, if I go into that washroom, or if I want to be in that sports team, or any of the controversial matters that we hear people talking about, people are going to know. So whether I'm a threat or not, or whether I'm whatever, people very clearly know I'm biologically male. They know that I'm undergone a transition, and that makes me the center of conversation. Well, it's understandable why our kids don't want to be the subject of those political conversations, and that drives the desperation. So in my mind, to resolve this, there's lots of things we can do, but we have to holistically understand all of that complexity and not just say, well, they should wait, or, well, we must let kids be their true selves, because there's more to the conversation than that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really great points. And I think we could talk about that a lot longer. There's one more topic that I do want to talk about on this, the more public one, is so, and you talked about this in your National Post article, and you touched on it in this conversation. What I'm trying to understand, because the big argument is that parents won't understand, or they'll shame or whatever the kids, but the teacher is the more appropriate person to be having that conversation with. So what are your thoughts about that whole discussion, and who's the best person? And I'm sure it probably goes to your last response. It's holistic and it depends. So I'll let you try.
Well, that is the hot topic conversation right now, right? Is the childhood social transitions. So just to stand that one up, we're not talking about medical. We're not talking about hormonal or surgical at this point. We're just saying social transition, which means names and pronouns. Mm-hmm. So, Jason is at school and Jason says, I want to be Julia. And the teacher says, okay, you're now Julia. I'll call you she, her, and goes up to the class and says, Jason is Julia. Okay, not a big deal on the surface. And that's the argument that gets used, is this is not a big deal. Nothing is permanent. It could be reversed. Who cares, right? They're kids. Sometimes they say, today I am a pilot, and they're pretending that they're an airplane and going around the kids. And we let kids do that, right? We don't have to get all upset about it and all worked up about it. But then you look at the conversation, the way it's happening, and it's inconsistent, because they tell us this isn't a big deal. And then a parent says, well, that's fine, but I would like to know because it's my kid. And I guess I'd like to know that my kid might be struggling with something. And then we say, well, we can't tell you because you might not affirm. You might harm the kid. You might be dangerous to the kid if you don't support them in this. And it's like, so it's not a big deal, but it's a really big deal at the same time, is kind of where we're framing this conversation. And
just so that, because I this is where the disconnect I don't understand is, if the parent has never been a threat to the kid before, why all of a sudden do they think, okay, now the kid's going to be shamed and kicked out and beaten? I was like, how did we get from, okay, this is a good parent? Like, I get it, maybe if there's been issues with the parent and the child and their social welfare or something, but is there any rational discussion behind that, or is that just 0 to 100?
That's where I believe the conversation is disingenuous. Mm-hmm. I delegate on this topic in school boards across the country. I've written, as you mentioned, at length about it with the National Post, and it's the same arguments that come up again and again. And that one particular argument, well, harmful families, well, harmful parents, they exist. Yes, they do exist. They've always existed. Yeah. And first of all, we have CAS, Children's Aid Services, who's there to deal with those situations. And I know something about that due to my family's situation, and we've worked with them, and they're great. And if you look at modern CAS, they don't even lean on removing the kid from a household. They lean on supporting the household. Their hope is to take the household and strengthen it. Say, abusive parents are abusive because there's problems, right? Because they're struggling. How can we help them? How can we help them help their kids, rather than how can we rip a family apart? And so we have this system that can do that and can support that. But like you mentioned too, this also just doesn't come, out of nowhere. If a parent is predisposed to abuse, if a parent is the kind of parent who might abuse their kid when they want to transition, is that truly the first time it's happened? Do you believe this is good, happy, hip households where nothing is wrong and someone says, I'm transgender, and bam, now we've flipped a switch to an abusive state? Like, that's probably a family that needs help and needs support. So if a kid comes and says, I'm not comfortable at home, to me, that's a huge red flag. We should see if that house needs support, right? Just like it's always been. We all know that teachers for the last 50 years have been told, if you suspect abuse, you report it so they can check. And it might be a false alarm. That's okay. We'd rather investigate and go, no, this household's okay, than not investigate and find out that there's a really tragic situation playing out and that we did nothing to support those kids. And that's what's so ridiculous in this conversation, is that it equivocates back and forth. It goes from this isn't a big deal to this is a super big deal to, like, we can't tell parents because they might be abusive. And I don't even know where that's supposed to lead. because I've been through a social transition, and sure, I was 28 when I did it. I wasn't 12, but at the same time, I experienced very, very acutely how it felt good to be called Julia, and it felt good to be called she, her. And I didn't start with my family, and I didn't start with my workplace. I started with my friends. I had this small group of 4 or 5 friends who would call me Julia and call me she, her, and it felt awesome. And all of a sudden, they're the only people I want to be around. And so I'm inviting them over to my house every night. They basically lived at my house for like a month because I had a big house and I didn't want to leave it because I wasn't comfortable going out to the rest of the world where I might be called Jason. I wanted to stay there. And I go to work, and all of a sudden it annoyed me when my coworkers called me Jason and him, even though they had done that the whole time. But now it bothered me because I was getting something different in my affirmation circle. And this is what we're doing to these kids. If you have a kid who wants to be called she, her, and Julia, and you say, well, we'll do that for 8 hours a day, not 8 hours a day, what is it, 5 hours a day at school. And at nights and weekends, you're going to be called Jason. Like, they're going to resent their parents more. They're going to resent their household more. You're going to create that wedge. Where's it going to go? What if they like it? What if they say, wow, I really want this. I think I do want to transition. Well, now at some point we have to have a conversation with that household who apparently might be abusive and say, your child has actually been transitioned for 1.5 years at school. Now they would like to go and talk to a doctor about hormones. Like, and I'd be furious as a parent if I found out that you were doing this with my kid. And it's just, I don't understand it, to be quite honest. Like, I don't even know what they're trying to achieve with it other than just being so fixated on it from this one angle that it's like the only way forward for them.
Yeah, well, and the only thing I ever wrote publicly about this before is, do you want your children having more trust in a temporary government agent or the parent? Because that's where I was like, and some of these elected officials are parents. So that's what I'm like, is that really what you want? You want your kid to be just talking to somebody temporary in their life that's not going to be there to support them later? Or like you said, how do we improve the family unit? And this is maybe where we could end on, is I think that's where we've kind of lost the conversation. And it's interesting that this is where we're going to, is this, what is the smallest structure unit for people is a family. And I think that's where we have to put in attention. We have to put in time. We have to put in effort. And we've kind of lost that. And this maybe goes to the like female male conversation. Women wanted to get empowered and go out and work, and I obviously totally support that. But at the same time, we can't neglect the smallest, most important unit, the family. And like, I'm big into yoga and meditation and everything, so we could like, who am I is a question I think about, but I think a lot of people don't take the time to actually figure out who they are and start to become comfortable for themselves who they are. And so that's why, like, they're looking for an identity. They're looking for a community because they failed or we haven't helped elevate them on the individual unit. And then on the family, it's gotten a little bit distracted is the word I'll use.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's where, like, any further thoughts here on just to wrap it up, and then we're going to do a few more minutes for the paid subscribers on X.
Sounds good. No, I don't think I have a few more thoughts unless there's another question you want to go into. But
no, I think that's good. I have a few juicy ones that I want to ask you on the paid subscription, and then I'll release it at some point for everyone because they're important topics. But
sounds good.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, and we'll be right back with you.